evening, everybody. Just a couple of announcements before our speaker tonight. So on Thursday, April 28th, so usually it's on Wednesdays, but this will be on Thursday, we're going to have Kat Adams speaking from the Unconscious Bias Project about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. And then in May, we'll be having Brad Zant. We don't have a date yet set for that. He's from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, so he'll be speaking about his work. And then on April 21st, which is the Thursday, from 1 to 2 p.m., in 621 Stanton Hall upstairs, we're going to have a board meeting. I'd like to invite whoever would like to join us to come. We could use all the fresh faces that want to support this program. So with that, I'll introduce our speaker. Tonight we have Professor Carol Burris, who's faculty at UCSF, where she studies functional regulatory networks and bacteria, using a combination of genetic, biochemical, and genomic approaches. She's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the AAAS. Professor Gross is a recipient of the NES Selman-Waxman Award in Microbiology, the AAAS Mentoring Award, and the UCSF Martin Luther King Award. Her other passion is to increase diversity in STEM, both by mentoring students and faculty, and by developing programs to increase student diversity. She will be discussing with us tonight the participation of women in science. Please join me in welcoming Professor.
Thank you so much. And it's really great that Berkeley is doing this. I think it's a fantastic thing. For some reason, recently, several different places have invited me to give talks. I just came back from Utah yesterday, not yesterday, but last Friday. And in every place that I go, I mention this group because I'm just so impressed with what you're doing. And you'll see it's on my slide. Okay, so I want to address the participation of women in science, problems and solutions, but everything that I say about women is also true about diversity, increasing diversity. You just have to 10x it, that's all. So what I'm going to talk to you about is some specific issues faced by women and minorities, some ways of going forward, and then just to give you a time point of how things used to be and how they are now, what's changed and what's the same. I'll just tell you about my path through science. Okay, so specific issues. So this study is a little outdated, but it's probably the most authoritative study that's been done in the U.S. By the National Academy of Sciences. It was a panel that was commissioned to figure out how you could increase the participation of women in science and engineering. You can see it's a while ago. It was chaired by a friend of mine, Joan Stites. I heard her give a talk about the work of this committee, which she was chair of. The committee was criticized because all of the members of the committee were women. And the thing that struck me is that what she learned from being the chair of the committee is how, and you'll see this throughout my talk, is how she was participating in the same discriminatory behaviors that her male cohorts were. Okay, so you can see this ends at 2006, and you can see that more women are earning science and engineering doctorates. In some fields, like the social sciences, it's over 50%, and in the life sciences, it's close to 50%. But the problem isn't simply the pipeline. So At the top research institutions, this was a while ago, but I doubt if it's much better, only 15% of the full professors in social and behavioral sciences and about the same amount in the life sciences are women. And it's even worse for minorities. So this is from a study that was done in German universities that was reported in PLOS Biology. And it shows you what happens to women at every stage in their careers. And you can see that women go from being a majority of the people enrolled to a constantly decrease in fraction of the total population. So the scissors diagram. The men go up and the women go down. Okay, so they asked what caused that. And I just am, and if you're interested, you can read the original study. But they debunked the following beliefs: that women are worse than men in math, that once the pipeline problem is solved, unequal representation will disappear. Although I don't know if it's true, but somebody at Utah told me that in the physical sciences, there's less dropping out of women along the way. But I don't know any studies that say that. Women are not as competitive as men and don't want jobs in academia. Academia is a meritocracy. Women faculty are less productive than men faculty. And women are more interested in family than careers. So those are the kinds of things that they looked at in this study, and then they provide evidence for each of these, that none of these explain this drop. So changing the rules means that the standards of excellence will be lowered. So what does impact women and minorities? So one question is stereotypes. We all know about stereotypes. Most of us believe most of the time that we ourselves don't have very many of them, but do they impact science careers? So here's a word diagram of words that are used to describe either men or women. And not surprisingly, this article, Madeira et al. In Applied Psychology, 2009, showed that the letters of recommendation for faculty position for men mirrored these same attributes. So women were described as affectionate, helpful, caring, sensitive, and the size of the word reflects the number of times it's used. And men are used, words for men are ambitious, dominant, independent. And it did not matter whether a woman was writing a letter. This is one of the things that Joan noticed, that when she looked back at her own letters, that she conformed to these same biases, even though Joan Stites has been an advocate for women's participation in science for 30 years. Now, an interesting question that you can raise, by the way, you should just interrupt me whenever you want, is how could you construct a letter of recommendation that would be gender neutral, where you wouldn't say, oh, this woman is too aggressive and pushy, that you wouldn't want to hire her, or whether that kind of bias no longer exists. I don't know, to tell you the truth. But at any rate, the important thing is that we all do this, whether we think we are or not. And that brings us to unconscious bias or implicit bias. And you've probably all heard of this, but what it means is that behaviors can be driven by learned stereotypes, and they operate at a subconscious level. They operate automatically, and therefore unconsciously, so you don't know that you're doing them when you're doing them. And that, of course, means that you don't have much control over them, because you don't realize that you're doing this. And I can tell you that since I became aware of this, that these slides, these first set of slides that I'm showing, are slides that we developed, that I developed in conjunction with the Minority Graduate Students Organization at Berkeley. And the person who really drove this was a wonderful graduate student, Julia Gerard, who's now a postdoc. And we used them for a diversity workshop. And the more I've become aware of the fact that this exists, the more I can see how it informs my behavior every day. And I don't think that you can get rid of it, but at least I'm becoming more and more conscious of the fact that I have these biases, and I project them. Now, aligned with implicit bias or unconscious bias is what's called stereotype threat. So this is when you internalize a negative stereotype yourself that the society holds, or any stereotype that society gives you, and then your behavior is affected by that stereotype. It gives anxiety and it gives poor performance. And I can't tell you how many studies have been done about this. But just a second. I forgot to change this. These slides are out of order. Okay. But here's an example of how stereotype threat operates. So if you give the SAT score to women, or to the SAP tests to women when they're in an only female classroom and it's a math test, women score worse when they're the only woman, which is in white, than if it's totally women. So that's stereotype threat, because you've internalized as women the idea that you're not as good in math. Whereas in the verbal SAT, which is right next to it, it doesn't matter to you whether you're in a mixed-sex room or whether you're in a same-sex room, because women are fine verbally. And the same thing has been done with African Americans in various situations. And there have been studies done where, depending on how you phrase the directions, African Americans can score worse or comparable to the average. Like if you say, oh, this kind of test, there's no bias in this test, everyone does fine, then everyone does fine. But if you can introduce things, in a way that people are worried, oh, this is when I'm not going to be able to perform as well, and this is something that's very important to me. And I think, I haven't read studies about this, but I do believe that the more fraught the situation that you're in, the worse the stereotype threat is. And for example, let's say if you're starting undergraduate school or graduate school or even a faculty position, those are the times when you're really under stereotype threat. And even if you've done okay at one level, then you go to the next level, and these kinds of things can impact your performance. Okay, now, let me just, sorry about this. Okay, now this is an example of implicit bias. I did it the wrong way. So this was a questionnaire that was sent out by Joe Handelsman to investigators at so-called Research 1 institutions. That means institutions that have a lot of research grants. They were sent to male and female investigators, and it was a CV of a putative technician that was a middle of the road in every respect. Didn't have any graduate degrees, didn't have much experience, had medium grades, and they were asked, and they were either given a male name or a female name. And then they were asked to say how competent they were, how hireable they were, and would you want to mentor them? And you can see that in every case, the male CV was viewed more favorably. And it didn't matter whether there were women or men who were viewing this CV. So that's an example of implicit bias. And again, this study has been done ad nauseum. It's been done with so-called African names versus whites with Latino names. It's probable that for some groups it's much worse than this dichotomy, but this exists over my colleagues, scientists like me. So this is something that everyone has to deal with. Okay, now a last thing is imposter syndrome, which probably comes in part from stereotype threat and from these implicit biases, but this is from Wikipedia now. It describes people who can't internalize their accomplishments. They remain convinced that they're frauds and they don't deserve the success that they've achieved. And if you do achieve success, it's luck. Or they're deceiving people who think they are more intelligent and competent than they believe themselves to be. So no matter what they do, it's not good enough, and you're not good enough, and something's always, this keeps you from relaxing and doing your best because you're always under a state of high anxiety. And it's particularly common among high-achieving women, and I'm sure it's also common among minorities. Now, these are results that were gathered by Margot Gerritsen at Stanford University. And this is an interesting thing. Every time I've given this talk, people have come up to me and said, oh, but you didn't talk about this or that, and here's some data that you can talk about. So I gave a talk at Stanford, and I got this data. So this is done by Margot Gerritsen in engineering, and it was questions to graduate students. There were 80 male and 100 female responses. And you can see that everyone has imposter syndrome. You're afraid to be found out. You're afraid to disappoint. Others are more capable. But you can notice there's a sex discrepancy, that women feel this much more than men. So, yep.
There were almost twice as many female answers.
Are those percentages?
These are percentages. Sorry. Okay, so these, I think, this is the landscape that we live in, that all of us live in. And what I'm not talking about in this talk at all is overt gender inequities. So the fact that there are discrepancies in startup packages, wages, and advancement, that's been documented from a study out of the Hutch. The number of women speakers at conferences are often not proportional to the number of women in the field. Daycare, the availability of daycare disproportionately affects women, although that's decreasing, but still it's a big impact if you don't have daycare. And there are many other things. I'm not talking about that. What I'm going to now tell you about it. And I know that you do some of this, and you've also heard about it from Judith, those of you who were there a year and a half ago, is what we can do to address this internal landscape that all of us carry with us that interacts with the sort of the external milieu, how we ourselves can help us to navigate this landscape. Now, here you are. Here are 2 proactive steps that I know about, and one of them is thriving in Berkeley, and then Stanford now has this Geneticists for Diversity in Science. And what I'm going to tell you about is a peer mentoring group that I was lucky enough to be invited to join when I moved to the Bay Area. Okay, so there's a book written about this, and you see there's one of your faculty there, Judith. So this photo was taken in front of the Einstein Statue. That's right in front of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was when several of us were inducted into the National Academy. And one thing that I want to say is that the women in this group have been extraordinarily successful, despite the fact that they're all at highly competitive institutions where all of these things are difficult. And that just points out the power of groups like this to help you navigate the system. So this book was written by Ellen Danielle, and most of the slides that I'm going to show you right now were given to me, and I adapted them by Ellen. So I just want to make a few comments about them. So we call this group, which meets every other Thursday. It used to meet every other Thursday. Now it meets every other Wednesday. Group. And group is about the power of not going it alone, of banding together with a group of peers to try and figure out how to do things. So it's an antidote to isolation and competition. It gives you practical support. And everything that happens in the group is confidential, which is a very, very important part of the group. And I think similar groups can work for other disadvantaged entities, minorities. I don't know what else, but I think, and they can. I think that it's likely that many men can also benefit from these groups. I think that there's much more sharing of all of the responsibilities of families than there used to be, and also life is getting tougher as a faculty member, and you need support. So what happens every other Thursday? So first of all, one of the members of the group facilitates the discussion, and there's a set framework for discussion. Now, if you read this book, and probably several of you have, and also it's available on Amazon, it can seem like there are a lot of arcane rules about how we do things, but the particular rules that have been adopted by this group may have enabled this group to function continuously for 40 years. Is that right? Almost 40 years. Okay, so there's a set framework for discussion, and you go around the circle and you say, okay, who wants to work and how much time do you want? And the purpose of that is to make sure that nobody monopolizes the conversation. So what happens during work? First of all, what kinds of issues do you talk about? So professional or personal issues, and it could also be specific issues or long-term general issues. And then the members of the group give you feedback. This feedback is honest, but it's neutral. Okay, now this is being able, the skills that we practice in this group are the skills that you need to be a successful mentor and also to navigate the landscape that you're in. You need to learn how to say what's important without invalidating the other person's point of view. So I know that for myself, in the time that I've been in this group, I have changed the way I say many things because of understanding that I can get very enthusiastic about my feedback, but the really important thing, and this is a really important thing in mentoring, is are you establishing a connection with the person that you're talking to so that you are both communicating something in a respectful way? Okay. And then so every group develops its own nomenclature. And this group has developed a nomenclature for what your negative self-perceptions. Some of these come from stereotype threat. They come from implicit bias. They come from imposter syndrome. Okay? But because this group meets together quite often and we see each other over our highs and lows, we get to know what pigs or negative perceptions each person has. So here's an example of something that someone said in group. I'm lazy about writing papers and I always put it off until there's a huge crunch. Well, maybe it's difficult to conceptualize. There are many reasons why you do this. Everyone has too much to do. Some people are better at writing than others. But this person is not acknowledging all of the positives that this person has, and they're all saying, I'm lazy. Or, I can never get the right message across when I'm critiquing a student's work. So when you carry those negative self-perceptions with you, when you're an imposter, you can't really frame things in a way that's most effective either for you or for the person that you're interacting with. So, now, what kind of strategies can we suggest? Well, one of the main strategies that group uses is they encourage people to make a contract. So one thing this group is it's not a complaint society. It is a society, it is a group of people that are dedicated to moving forward together to make all of our lives better. So a contract, it's a precise formulation of objectives, and importantly, it's both positive and possible. And we work with each other to actually sculpt these contracts so that when you read the contract, you don't think, oh, I forgot to do this. You think, I'm pretty good. I can make this better. So, or, I now have a strategy. So here's an immediate contract. I'm going to set aside a full day each week to work at home on my manuscripts, acknowledging the fact that one of the reasons that you might not be able to work on your manuscripts is because when you get to work, there are so many other things that you have to do. Okay. This is a broader or long-range contract. I'll work to include time for whatever in my life, quiet thought, my family, whatever. And then there are many recurring themes that we talk about, and these are just some of them. And I mean, I myself have learned a huge amount from this group. Okay, and then the last part of it is after we've worked, we have strokes and social time. Now, what are strokes? Strokes are, as Ellen says, little gifts to go home with. So here's an example of a stroke. So in other words, we're complimenting one of the members on something that was important about the work that they did. A stroke for how you always get right to the heart of the issue. A stroke for your work tonight. You're taking care of your health and taking care of the people in your lab. Okay, now I want to tell you something. I want to tell you two anecdotes that were very important to me, sort of bookmarked about 15 years apart. The first was when I first came, shortly after I first came to group, maybe the first year, or I don't know whether it was the second. Anyway, we gave a presentation to the Women in Science at the cell biology meeting. And I think there were like 1,000 people in this room. It was a huge room. And we each gave a little presentation about what group meant to us and sort of what it was like. This was before there was a book about it. And as I looked out on this audience of women, and there were also some men there, of course, women were sobbing. They were crying. They said, and then they got up and they started talking, and some of them were still crying. They said, if I had had this group, my life would have been better. I would have been more successful. And it really shocked me. Okay, now I had another sort of experience of the same type that was also very uplifting. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst to give a talk both about mentoring and about my science. And the actual reason that I was invited was that the year before, the university had gotten a small grant to do something for mentoring. And they're sitting around, I mean, they told me this story. They're sitting around and they're trying to decide, okay, they have this grant, what are they going to do? And sort of typical of those, you know, how universities work. And then someone says, you know, I have this book every other Thursday. Let's set up groups. So that's what they did. They bought everyone a copy. They queried the whole female and minority faculty across the social sciences and the hard sciences, and they set up 2 groups. One that went all the way from assistant professors to deans. So it was one group met during the day and the other group met at night. And this was the 1-year anniversary of it. So when I got there, I was invited to a dinner with all the women from the groups, and the women in the 2 groups actually didn't know each other. And so I just asked them, what did group mean? Did it mean anything to you? Did it accomplish anything? And they just went around the table and they were talking. And it was amazing. They said, it totally validated me. I would not have gotten tenure without this group. And what was striking was they said the same thing about group that we say about group. And then they also told an anecdote that they were worried they wouldn't know what to do. So they all came to the first meeting with their copies of Every Other Thursday. And they thought that what they would do was they would just pick something out of some situation that was talked about, and then they would discuss it. But the minute they got in this room, they discovered they didn't need this book. I mean, other than to set the format of the meeting. So it's a very powerful thing. And I've experienced it firsthand. Okay, so I just want to briefly tell you my story. So when I decided when I was in high school that I was going to be a biochemical geneticist, and I was going to go to college and get a PhD. The reason I decided this was because I followed my grandmother around in the garden, and I decided I wanted to breed different color flowers. I had to write a paper when I was in high school about what did I want to do, and I lived in Brooklyn, as you can probably tell from my accent. So I went to the Brooklyn Public Library, and they had a Rolodex of careers, and I paged through it, and I saw biochemical geneticist. Okay, fine. So then I went to Cornell University. I was a botany major. I wanted to get a PhD. And my advisor said that there was no career path for women scientists, that the only way you could become a scientist is if you married a scientist. Okay. Well, that was the end of the PhD. In the version of New Goal, I was going to become a teacher. I switched my major from botany to science education. Then I went to Brooklyn College to get my master's degree because you needed a master's for permanent certification. And at Brooklyn College, I met Clara Blake. She was my professor. There were 2 women on the faculty at Brooklyn College. They were both hired during the Second World War, for obvious reasons. Only 2 women. Now, they convinced me, well, first of all, I liked teaching in college much more than high school, and second of all, they convinced me that I should go for it. So I decided even if there was no job, I would go for it. And by the way, I don't believe that my advisor was prejudiced against women. I think he was telling me how it was. And years later, I met a woman who was, an eminent enough scientist so that she was in the National Academy. When I told the story, she said, well, that's how I was. I married my husband. And she never got a PhD. Okay, so then I went to the University of Oregon. I got a PhD with Aaron Novick and did a postdoc with Pete von Hippel. These are the early people in the Institute of Molecular Biology. It's Frank Stoll, George Streisinger, Aaron Novick, Pete von Hippel. This was a phenomenal place to be a student. It was just a cauldron. And my advisor was very positive about me, but I actually had my first child when I started the first year of graduate school, and he said, Carol, I don't think you can be a good mother and a good scientist. I said, well, I'm going to try. And by the time I finished my degree, he said, you changed my mind. It was based on his actual experience of the women that he had known who would become scientists, and he just wanted me to know that. So here I am with my son Steve when I was a graduate student, and this is my daughter Miriam. They're both professors now. One in sort of single molecule biophysics, and the other modern Chinese history. Okay, so then I went to the University of Wisconsin, worked with Dick Burgess and Howard Temin, had a phenomenal impact on my life. Here's Dick Burgess and Howard Temin. While I was there, Howard Temin won the Nobel Prize. I listened once to, at the National Academy of Sciences, they always have lunches where some woman gives a talk about how they succeeded. And there was a woman who I think was the head of Bell Labs, and I don't remember her name. But what she said is, behind every successful woman, there's a powerful man. And that was the case for me. The reason I got a faculty position at Wisconsin was because Howard Temin was advocating for me. And he was, important and had just won the Nobel Prize, and so I got it. Is everything okay?
I'll check if it's right. I think we're fine.
Okay, and then I moved to UCSF and member of 2 departments. Then you already heard what I do. So, and what I want to point out here is that I worked on many different things. I've started out working on how regulatory proteins work in vivo and then in vitro, and then I started working on transcription and stress responses, and now I'm working on global approaches to gene function and regulation of translation. Okay, this was a picture that was taken on the 30th anniversary of my lab, so I've had absolutely phenomenal people. I'm in touch with most of them. I'm really lucky. And this was when I got the Martin Luther King Award for Diversity at UCSF. Again, I've worked very hard to help people feel comfortable and to develop pipelines into the university, in part because I know what it was like.
What is this award for?
So it's to increase diversity at UCSF. And so I've really developed a pipeline. I've sort of sculpted the summer research program, so it's a pipeline, and we do outreach to all the UCs and Cal States and some other places, and go to major meetings to increase the diversity. And in the tetrad program, I mean, the diversity has increased in all the programs. This is a school-wide program that I started, but now a tetrad program, which is one of the top-ranked programs in the country for the last several years. Our entering class is 30% minority. And this is me with my family, my son, my daughter, my son's wife, and my grandson. And what I just wanted to end with is, this is a reference to, this is something written by Marlene Belfort about the whole issue of motherhood and science, and it's about the win-win potential for motherhood and science. So what she argues, this is one, there's actually another one that was in Science, but I couldn't find that one. What she argues is having children enables you to balance your life, because you're at work, things are shitty, you come home, you have to pay attention to your kids, you have a loving, fun relationship, and you're revitalized to go back to your science. So even though there are going to be times in your life when you might be more tired because your children aren't sleeping, on the other hand, it's revitalizing you. So that's the end of what I had to say, but I just want to say, share one thing with you. When I was at Utah, after I did a presentation like this, I did breakout groups where I asked people to focus on what could be some institutional solutions, in particular at Utah. And what I want to show you is, I just wanted you to look, this is, the thing that I like about giving these is that each time I give a talk like this, I learn things that I hadn't thought about. And so one of the faculty members talked about mobilizing allies. Well, what are allies? Allies are people who are sympathetic to the struggles of women and minorities, but are not themselves either women or minorities. So, for example, just one anecdote. I teach in a graduate course, and when I came, that graduate course was being given from 4 to 5:30 or 4 to 6, I can't remember. It's a totally unfriendly time for women to have young children. And there were several women in the course, but none of the women tried to change the time. And then there was a male head of the course, and he was very involved with his kids. He had 2 young kids. He said, this is crazy. This course is not being given from 4 to 6 anymore. It's being given at some time when you can go home and have dinner with your families. So that's an example of an ally changing a culture. The fact that I've been advocating for increasing diversity in a way that someone who's African American or Hispanic can't advocate. I have watched the culture change over the years that I've been doing this. So now everyone accepts that, yes, that we want to do this. This is who we are. But it wasn't that way when I started. So, and apparently there's a school, which is either North or South Dakota, which actually is capitalizing on this. And they're picking people who are very sympathetic to improving the atmosphere. They're providing them with training in these issues, and then they're having them go and talk with small groups of people. Now, a place, for example, where this could be very useful is, I was just at Utah talking to freshman and sophomore women through an access program, and several of them were in engineering, and they were talking about the sexism that they experience as being the only woman. But yet they were also sure that the men in the class didn't understand this, and also some of the ways that the men faculty members interacted with them. And this is a kind of example, and there are many of them, where these allies could be used in a sort of school-wide program to really help change the culture. Okay, I'm done.
Any questions?
Hi.
I had a question about the scissors diagram.
About the scissors, yeah.
Yeah, when it was taken, was that a snapshot in time, or did you follow a particular group over the course of their career?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it was, so the study was also older, so it was just, I don't know the answer to that question. I should know. That's a really good question. I don't know the answer.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but I don't know how I feel about it, but I'm wondering if you know how you feel. I know a little bit how Judith feels about gender-specific awards in our field. Usually they're not male-specific, they're female-specific, the ones I know of.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a thought? I'm conflicted myself about their value.
Okay. I actually think they're important. So this is, Judith doesn't. Okay, so this is a reflection of how society is at this point. I was just reading about this in politics. So they talk about women's issues as when you're appealing to a niche group of women, but women are actually a majority of the people who vote. So why are they talking about women's issues instead of men's issues? So the reason is that that the standard is the man. Okay, that's accepted. If you're part of that group, you don't have to be anything else. You're in. Okay, everything else is compared to that group. So I think that I don't think that I would like it always to be the case that you do need women's awards, but I think that as a point in time to point out that there are qualified women who are not getting awards, it could be a useful strategy. But it's a sort of a reflection of what is.
But do you have any
Wait, let Judith respond.
Sorry,
Yeah, at the ACS, so there's been an award specifically for women, and many of the women in the profession refused to be nominated. It was kind of an agreement, informal. And what has evolved is that with more women then getting nominated for the mainstream awards, which has happened,
Yeah.
has been slow, the Women's Award has kind of turned itself around 180 degrees, and now it's quite an honor. You know what I'm saying? Once the women became
Yep.
mainstream,
So it's the opposite of what I'm saying,
all
yeah.
of a sudden, the Women's Award is, well, there are so many fantastic women. I don't get that award.
Yeah.
So I think you can argue either way.
It's not something that I feel strongly about,
Yeah.
but,
So if I could just add one
Yeah.
comment. I was
Yeah.
the committee for a society for the awards, and they suddenly had an award with a woman's name on it.
Yeah.
Okay, it was not a woman's award. And so, in case you don't know, the only way someone can win an award is if someone nominates you. It's very hard to win if you don't get nominated. And so that's often what you try to do, get enough people nominated. All of a sudden, unsolicited, nomination for women started coming into this award, whereas they weren't coming in for the other awards.
yep.
Yeah, that's
So I think, so I don't know how I feel, but
I don't know, it's a complicated issue, and it's certainly, one strategy that certainly helps is to get women on nominating committees. Okay, so for example, the first woman to get there's a molecular biology award that's given by the National Academy of Sciences, and the first woman to get that award was Erin O'Shea, and I was chair of that nominating committee. So. And, also people who are on the committees, they solicit nominations. And the thing is that you solicit nominations from the networks that you're in. And until there's an old girls network that's comparable to the old boys network, there are not going to be as many women nominated unless people are thinking about it.
I think she knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was more on that issue because I was wondering whether you actually, if you know or you have any data on whether those gender-specific awards or women-specific awards actually increase women participation, not just of the women.
No, that's a really good question. So I think there are two things. I don't know the answer to the question, first of all, but I'm just going to use that to comment on. First of all, there's a lot of this research that I don't know. So there may be information on that. But this is not the kind of research that people who are social scientists think it's high profile to do. And I think it's really important, but yet I'm sure there would be funding for it from various science agencies, if not anything. And especially in a school like Berkeley, where you have these people and you have scientists, it would be great to set up some collaborative studies to answer. There are tons of questions that we can think about, but I'm not sure that there's data on most of them. Often I've asked people, but I don't know that I've done that much searching myself, but just anecdotally,
My advisor, a long time ago, my PhD advisor, told me not to go for one of these things because it feels like the Special Olympics.
Yeah.
Which I thought it was, well, that's not very, I was young. And
Yeah.
I felt it just, okay, so I won't do that because it's not a very, it doesn't carry, I don't know, it's not going to help me.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
Annette.
Nice to talk, Carol. I was curious about two things. One is you mentioned that all of us that are sitting here have implicit or unconscious bias.
Mm-hmm.
So even if we were to change the ratio of women and minorities, for example, on a committee, we still have the same culture. You mentioned some of the work that you've done at UCSF with the pipeline of increasing diversity in the graduate students, and I have seen an increase in the number of, for example, female faculty. But the culture itself hasn't changed, so how are we going to, how do you propose maybe we start what can we do to actually
Yeah.
start shifting our perception, start changing, as a whole?
Yeah.
Because just numbers isn't going
Right.
to fix it.
So what I know that some universities are doing is they are giving members of search committees training in implicit bias. And some people are talking very positively about the effects. They have like various checklists that you can do. There might be, I don't know, again, I don't know how, I mean, there really needs to be a lot of research done on this sort of thing, and I just don't know.
Okay.
But there are things like that that are being tried. I think, when I first started doing this stuff, nobody was talking about implicit or unconscious bias. It's really in the news now. You're going to have a talk about it from somebody, and it would be good to ask them these questions. Anything else? Yeah.
In your search of like literature and all the studies that you've seen, has there been anything in terms of like addressing like?
Could you speak a little louder?
Oh, sorry. In terms of addressing internalized oppression or things like in the realm of like implicit bias, or like imposter syndrome, like you're saying.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's like trying to look at like the role of psychotherapy, like or sort of?
I'm not really. If I say no, that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but you haven't come across anything like that.
But I haven't come. But one thing that might be sort of tangentially relevant to what you said is, and I think there was somebody who wrote a book about this recently. I think she's now president of Barnard, but I'm not positive, about the changes that they made at the Harvard Business School, because women were dropping out of that business school at such a high rate. That they started out, they gave women training in, speaking up and advocating for yourself, and they also gave men training. So they tried to change the culture. I've heard anecdotally from people that the women that are coming out of this program now are powerhouses. So that's how you can sort of change a culture. My bias is that psychotherapy is not so useful, that a peer group is much more useful. Yeah.
I was curious to hear about your thoughts about the current model of funding in science, in particular in the United States and globally. It's very competitive, and I have heard professors coming to my department to give talks and have lunch with graduate students and calling it a rat race and a pyramid scheme. So that kind of funding environment is really just fueling certain kinds of. If that stays like that, then we can. I don't think that things will actually significantly change. And I don't
Yeah, it's.
that should even change. That's how things are, and that's how we get the best of the best.
Well, it's driven by the fact that, there was an unsustainable rise in science. The NIH, there are a couple of things that are driving it. Some inherent problems in the funding model itself, and then there are other political things that are driving it, but it's being driven by the fact that the budget isn't big enough for all the people who want it. And that in the United States, you can take salaries off of your grants, so you can be at so-called soft money institutions, and then that takes a lot of salary money to support yourself. And by the lack of funding, appropriations. nonetheless, it's true, it's very competitive now, and you have to think seriously about it. But also, it's not just science. Everything is very competitive now. A lot of other fields it seems to be, I still know young faculty who are getting a lot of pleasure out of it, but I think it is a much more difficult career. But as I look around at other careers, I'm not sure that they are so much better. I just don't know. We know the problems with our career, but we don't see the problems with other careers. But I do think that there's going to have to be I agree with you that right now, it's not. That's why I said it would be interesting to see how you think about my story versus how it is now. It's not so explicit, but there are still many barriers that are facing men and women, Caucasians and non-Caucasians, in meeting the challenges. So, yeah. That was a non-answer. Yeah.
For people plan in a career, like want to be a professor someday, like some of us may at some point heard, like, okay, if you want to apply for those really competitive scholarships, that it will be better for you to switch places. Like you can't stay in the same school when you did your PhD, or like you can't take gaps to train. Like if people see that on your CV, that seems like a bad thing. But in my opinion, those things may affect women more than the men.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how did this trend start? Who says like people have to switch places? People cannot take time off.
Well, yeah.
Can you comment a little bit on that?
Well, in Europe, you do have paid family leave, and this is not just for science. This is the climate in the United States. I do want to point out that, as I told you in my story, when I decided that I was going to become a faculty member, I didn't really think there was any path forward for me in science. Okay? I just did it because I loved it. And I think you have to choose what you love. If you're not doing something that you love, that you can put your heart and soul into, you're not going to be able to deal with the downs. So that's the first thing. Choose something that you love, and then see where you float in that universe of the things that you love. Any more questions? Yeah. No, it's fine. That's why I'm here.
Yeah, I didn't want to comment, but if you know whether in other countries, like in Europe, where the policies for maternity are much more...
Oh, yes, they're much better.
Do you know the participation of women in science in higher positions or in
So this is interesting because Europe has, well, like let's say Germany has been terrible. Historically, it's been terrible because, for example, in Germany, the public schools, the kids still go home for lunch. There's no there wasn't, I don't know, there probably is now. But a former postdoc of mine is a recent former postdoc is a faculty member in Europe at the EMBL. And apparently, Germany is seriously considering putting in quotas for women. And I think that may be in common in the EU. So, if you're European, you may want to go back to Europe. Yep. You have to talk loud.
If you were to institute quotas like that, do you think it would actually be helpful, or do you think that it would increase the perception that women don't have to have the same standards?
Right. I think it's a very fraught issue. But what I do think, I think it will increase that perception But, you know, this is one example of a situation where women might have it bad, but minorities, non-Caucasian, have it worse. Because one of the things that I did when I was at UCSF was, after going to a national meeting, I understood for the first time that recruiting students is one thing and retaining them and having them thrive is another thing. So we did focus groups to figure out how a majority and our minority students felt about how supportive the university was. And what we found was the minority students felt that they were not supported at all. And I know it still happens all the time. There's a non-Caucasian student, a minority student, and let's say they get a fellowship, and their classmates will say, oh, well, of course you got that fellowship. The implication being, well, it's just because you're not Caucasian. So this happens at UCSF. It's happened a number of times. This is an actual story. So it's going to happen. The only thing that can change it is getting to a critical mass of a group. How you get there, I don't know. But I think I will be, if they do institute these quotas in Germany and in Europe, I hope that someone studies it. I mean, we need to have some data. Yeah.
I just want to go back to the question regarding the maternity in Europe. I come from Europe and I come from the Czech Republic, and I don't think that it's very good there, because society in the Czech Republic expects that the mother will stay 2 or 3 years at home with one kid, and also they will receive money for 2 or 3 years, not that much, but something. So it's kind of expected, and there is no place where to put small kids.
Yeah.
For example, my mom, I have a younger sister, so my mom stayed 6 years at home with me and my sister, and she didn't manage to go back to science. So it's
Yeah.
also a downside.
Yeah, right. It's very complicated. I think there's one country, some of the Scandinavian countries are experimenting with having parental leave, where they both take it, and maybe not for as long. And of course, in those countries, there are also excellent daycare facilities. So I think that's the problem with this, that there are a huge number of things that you have to address at the same time. And you change one thing, and then the system is out of balance for another reason. Yeah, but thank you for that comment. Lynette.
Last question is about, you mentioned retention of students, retention of, say, young faculty, for example. And one of the things I think that becomes apparent to me as I sort of, finished grad school and looking into my next options is that there are some clear differences in academia versus outside of academia. And one of those has to do with both repercussions and, recognitions for, let's call it like good behavior, for, doing things well versus poor behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So because academia, everything is centered around the professor, there's a big power differential that is sort of permanent. And I feel from my conversations with young faculty, it continues on. So the more senior faculty have still that greater power differential than a young faculty who's, for example, pre-tenured or just got tenured or hasn't gotten an R01. And I wonder what you think about, and there's a lot of ideas that have been flowing forever, about how we could actually restructure academia in a way that the structure itself lends itself to a better culture, it lends itself to something that's less hierarchical.
Right. So you probably realize by now from hearing me that I'm sort of a gradualist. So I think that things can be implemented step by step. So, for example, in terms of like faculty hierarchy, you can set it up so that the young faculty have a lot of power. And in some places that I've been, they say, oh, well, the young faculty, the ones that are going to live with these colleagues, we really have to pay attention to how you feel about these various things. And in other places, that's not true. It's much more hierarchical. So I think it's really important to try and introduce some checks and balances. I think really students should be apprised of their rights. I think that we need much more intervention, like ombudsman and whatever. So I think that we need to try and change the culture. And I'm not sure that you can legislate it. I mean, maybe somebody can, but sort of above my pay grade. You know what, but I just have to say that I'm a person who works from the ground up. I sort of know what's going on the ground and try and change the ground.
All right. Well, let's thank Professor Gross once again. There's going to be beer and wine out front once I wheel the cart out in a minute.